The gold coin didn't just drop, it rang. It struck the scarred floorboards of Hobson's General Store so hard that the afternoon chatter died instantly, leaving 11 people holding their breath. For 9 long years, Red Hollow had watched Clara Whitmore starve politely. They turned her into a local story, the hardworking girl who never complained, a neat narrative for townsfolk to feel warm about while no one brought her a single bowl of soup. Meanwhile, her 11-year-old brother, Toby, was fading behind a bedroom wall, and Clara was down to a 4-day countdown before the town doctor walked away for good. Then he walked in. A ragged traveler wearing cracked boots and a split leather coat, smelling of pine smoke and cold wind. He didn't ask, he dropped a fortune in pure gold onto the counter and delivered a chilling proposition. "Marry me. I don't know your name, but your brother's got 4 days." The town laughed. Del Rugard grinned by the stove, waiting for everyone to join in, but nobody laughed, because inside her chest, something wild and desperate began to beat. Clara didn't know it yet, but this poor, rough mountain man wasn't just a drifter off the road. He carried a 14,000-acre secret, a box of 31 letters from a shared past, and a quiet, terrifying resolve to upend every polite lie the town had built around her. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the legacy this cowboy is hiding will break your heart before it heals it. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind coming off the timberline ridge didn't just blow, it scraped. It carried the bitter bite of frozen pine and wet earth, dragging it relentlessly across the grand stone steps of Abbott Manor. Ruth Abbott knelt on the second step, her knees bruising against the frost-heaved granite. She wore a coarse gray cotton apron pulled tight over a faded brown dress, the cuffs worn straight through to the pale threads beneath. Beside her, a wooden bucket of lye water had already formed a thin, jagged crust of ice. Ruth plunged the stiff bristles of her scrub brush into the freezing water, ignoring the sharp sting. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split and bleeding in faint red lines that washed away in the gray suds. She scrubbed the stone until her shoulders burned, her breath coming in short, white plumes that vanished into the harsh afternoon air. Death. In the right pocket of her apron, her numb fingers curled around a small wooden sewing spool. The wood was smooth, carved with 2 faded initials she could trace without looking. It was the only thing in the world she actually owned. Everything else, the dress on her back, the roof she slept under, the very name she carried, belonged to Silas Abbott. "You missed a spot by the pillar." The voice was warm and entirely unbothered by the cold. Ruth didn't look up. She kept her head bowed as Beatrice Abbott, wrapped in a heavy burgundy wool cloak lined with silver fox fur, stepped out onto the porch. Beatrice didn't look at Ruth as a sister or even as a servant. She looked at her the way one might look at a stubborn stain on the floorboards. "Father is expecting a guest," Beatrice said, her leather-gloved hand resting on the polished brass rail. "He wants the courtyard immaculate. Do try not to bleed on the stone, Ruth. It defeats the purpose of washing it." "Yes, Beatrice," Ruth said quietly. Her voice was steady, stripped of any defiance that might earn her a night without firewood. That was the rule of Abbott Manor. You survived by becoming invisible. You endured by becoming useful. Beatrice huffed a small breath of amusement and walked down the steps, her heavy skirts brushing past Ruth's freezing hands. As the carriage carried the favored daughter away toward town, the heavy oak doors of the manor creaked open behind Ruth. The whispers of the household staff drifted out into the freezing air, carried by the frantic energy of a house preparing for an execution. "They say he's completely ruined," Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, muttered to a passing maid. "The banks took the High Pine Mill last Tuesday, took the land, took the timber, took the horses." "Then why is Mr. Abbott letting him in the front door?" the maid whispered back. "Because he owes Silas Abbott $3,000, and a ruined man is a desperate man. They say he's coming to offer a marriage to settle the ledger." He's looking to claim one of the daughters to tie the remaining Thorne name to the Abbott money. Ruth kept scrubbing, but her hands slowed. The Thorne name. Everyone in the valley knew of the Thornes. Once, they had owned the very timber that built Abbott Manor. But the father had died, the empire had crumbled, and the son had vanished into the high country, living like a wild mountain man while the banks devoured his inheritance. Now, Garrett Thorne was coming down from the ridge, a bankrupt heir, a desperate man with nothing left to his name but debts and pride. And Silas Abbott, a man who traded human dignity like currency, was waiting for him in the drawing room, ready to humiliate the last Thorne for sport. The crunch of heavy boots on the frozen gravel stopped the whispers instantly. Ruth froze. She hadn't heard a carriage. She hadn't heard a horse. He must have walked the 3 miles up the valley road in the dead of winter. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood at the edge of the courtyard. He did not look like a beggar. He did not look like a man who had lost an empire. He stood tall, his frame wire-muscled and grounded like granite. He wore a dust-covered canvas coat that fell past his hips, and faded denim trousers tucked into muddy, battered boots. The wind whipped at his short, dark hair, revealing an angular face weathered by brutal sun and biting cold. A thin, faded scar cut across his left cheekbone, pale against his sun-darkened skin. But it was his eyes that made the breath stall in Ruth's chest. They were a sharp, piercing amber brown, scanning the grand facade of Abbott Manor not with awe, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man measuring timber for the axe. He didn't move toward the door immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a silver pocket watch. The crystal face was severely cracked. Click. The sound of the silver casing snapping shut echoed across the frozen courtyard, sharp as a gunshot. Garrett Thorne stepped forward. His boots left heavy, deliberate prints in the frost. As he reached the base of the stone steps, he stopped. He looked down at the bucket of iced lye water. He looked at the gray suds freezing on the granite. And then, slow, his sharp amber eyes moved up to find Ruth. Ruth instinctively pulled her bleeding, raw hands into the folds of her apron, a sudden flare of shame burning in her cheeks. She was used to being looked down upon, used to being ignored. But the way this ragged, ruined mountain man looked at her wasn't with pity, and it wasn't with cruelty. He looked at her with an absolute, terrifying stillness. "The water's frozen," Garrett said. His voice was a low, rough rasp, like heavy timber dragging over stone. It carried the faint, cold scent of pine. "I have to finish the steps, sir," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Mr. Abbott is expecting a guest." Garrett held her gaze for one long, agonizing second. He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply looked at her raw, bleeding knuckles hidden in her apron, then looked at the heavy oak doors of the manor. "He is," Garrett said quietly. He stepped past her, the hem of his canvas coat brushing against her shoulder. As he walked into the house that treated her like dirt, Ruth clutched the carved wooden spool in her pocket, a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread settling in her stomach. Silas Abbott was waiting inside to offer a daughter to a ruined man, and Silas Abbott never gave away anything of value. The drawing room of Abbott Manor was suffocatingly warm, heavy with the scent of polished mahogany, expensive cigar smoke, and imported floral perfume. It is a room designed to make men feel small. Silas Abbott sat behind his massive desk, a ledger open before him, his manicured fingers steepled beneath his chin. Garrett Thorne stood in the dead center of the Persian rug. He hadn't bothered to wipe his boots. The melting frost mixed with mountain mud, leaving dark, ugly stains on the pristine woven wool. He did not remove his hat. He did not shift his weight. He stood with the unnatural, unnerving stillness of a man used to waiting out a blizzard in the high country. his canvas coat dripping slowly onto the floor. $3,000, Garrett, Silas said, breaking the silence. He leaned back, a smug smile stretching across his well-fed face. That is what your father's name is worth today, nothing more. I heard the bank chained the gates of the High Pine Mill this morning. A tragedy, really. A titan of the timber industry, reduced to a beggar in muddy denim. Garrett did not blink. His amber-brown eyes remained locked on the older man, flat and unreadable. The debt is $3,000. Garrett's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the warm air like a rusted saw. I came to clear the ledger. Silas let out a short, patronizing laugh. With what? Pine cones? You don't have a dime, Thorne. Everyone in the valley knows you've been living like a wild animal up on the ridge since the money dried up. Silas closed the ledger with a sharp snap. I know why you're here. You want Beatrice. You think tying your ruined name to my daughter will stop the creditors from picking your bones clean. Garrett said nothing. His silence seemed to irritate Silas, who preferred men who begged or blustered when cornered. I will not give my flesh and blood to a bankrupt mountain man, Silas sneered, his true cruelty finally surfacing. Beatrice is meant for a governor's son, not a savage who sleeps in the dirt. But Silas's eyes gleamed with a sudden, vicious amusement. I am a merciful man, and I do have a surplus in this house. Silas reached across his desk and rang a small brass bell. A moment later, the heavy oak doors opened. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, pushing a trembling figure forward into the room. It was Ruth. She stood frozen on the edge of the expensive rug, the bucket of lye water abandoned in the hall. Her coarse gray apron was damp, the hem of her brown dress stiff with cold. She instinctively hid her hands in the folds of her apron, desperately trying to conceal her raw, bleeding knuckles. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her deep blue eyes darting from Silas Abbott's cruel smile to the imposing back of the stranger in the canvas coat. This is Ruth, Silas announced, gesturing toward her as if presenting a slightly defective piece of furniture. She is a ward of this house, a charity case my late wife took in. She costs me more in firewood and bread than she earns in labor. Ruth stopped breathing. She knew that tone. It was the tone Silas used when he was negotiating the sale of a lame horse. She is entirely unremarkable, Silas continued, enjoying the sound of his own voice. But she knows how to scrub a floor, she doesn't eat much, and she's used to the cold. She's sturdy enough for whatever miserable cabin you're squatting in. Silas leaned forward, tapping a pen against the desk. Sign a marriage contract today. Take her out of my sight, and I will strike the $3,000 debt from my ledger. You walk away free of me, and she becomes your problem. That is my only offer, Thorne. The room went deathly quiet. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner dared to make a sound. Ruth's vision blurred. The edges of the room began to tilt. Traded for a debt. The words echoed in her skull, sharp and violently cold. She was 21 years old, and her entire life, her dignity, her future, had just been priced at $3,000 of a dead man's debt. She was not a person to Silas Abbott. She was collateral. She was property. She looked at the mountain man, expecting him to laugh, expecting him to demand a better bargain. Garrett turned slowly. He looked at her. Ruth braced herself for the look of disgust. But as those sharp amber eyes locked onto her pale, terrified face, she saw no pity and no revulsion. He looked at the trembling line of her shoulder. He looked at the bruised dignity in her blue eyes. He looked at the way her hands were hidden, knowing exactly what the cold stone steps had done to them. Garrett reached into his pocket. He pulled out the silver pocket watch. Click. He opened the casing, exposing the cracked crystal, frozen forever at 4:15. He stared at the broken dial for 3 full seconds. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then he snapped it shut and dropped it back into his coat. "Draw up the paper," Garrett said. Silas blinked, momentarily thrown by the lack of hesitation. "You agree? Just like that?" "Write it," Garrett said, his voice dangerously low. "Write that the debt is settled in full. Write that she belongs to no one in this house the moment the ink dries." Silas's smile returned, cruel and triumphant. "As you wish." For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the scratching of Silas's pen. Ruth stood paralyzed. Her hand tightened around the carved wooden spool in her apron pocket so hard her fingernails dug into her own flesh. She was being sold to a stranger who looked like he could snap a man's neck with his bare hands, a man who had just traded a fortune in debt for a maid. Silas slid the paper across the desk. Garrett stepped forward, took the pen, and signed his name with a heavy, illegible scrawl. He didn't even read the terms. "She's yours, Thorne," Silas said, folding his hands. "Try not to let her freeze to death before spring. It would be a waste of a good transaction." Garrett dropped the pen. He didn't look at Silas again. He turned completely, closing the distance between himself and Ruth. Up close, he was massive, blocking out the light from the parlor windows. He smelled of harsh winter air, wet canvas, and something deeply, inherently untamed. Ruth flinched, her body expecting a rough hand to grab her arm and drag her out. Garrett didn't touch her. He stopped 2 feet away, keeping a deliberate distance. "Do you have a coat?" he asked. Ruth stared at him, her lips parted in shock. "Not an order, a question." "No, sir," she whispered, her voice barely working. "Just this." She gestured to the thin brown dress and the damp apron. Garrett's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered in his cheek near the faded scar. He looked back at Silas Abbott, and for a fraction of a second, Ruth saw something terrifying flash in the mountain man's eyes, a cold, calculated promise of violence that had absolutely nothing to do with a broken timber mill. "Then we leave now," Garrett said, returning his gaze to her. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't say goodbye to the master of the house. He simply turned and walked toward the grand oak doors, fully expecting her to follow. And Ruth Abbott, who had just been sold to clear a ruined man's ledger, took a shaky breath, loosened her grip on the wooden spool, and walked out into the freezing wind behind him. The heavy oak doors of Abbott Manor slammed shut behind them, and the sound was swallowed instantly by the howling wind. Ruth stood at the top of the stone steps, the bitter cold hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The gray suds from her scrub bucket had already frozen solid over the granite. Without the oppressive heat of the drawing room to protect her, the moisture in her coarse cotton apron turned into a sheet of ice against her thighs. The worn cuffs of her brown dress offered no defense against the wind cutting down from the timberline. Her teeth began to chatter, a violent, involuntary clicking she tried desperately to clamp down on. Garrett Thorne did not look back. He walked with long, purposeful strides across the frosted gravel, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the quiet afternoon. Ruth hurried to follow, her thin leather shoes slipping on the ice. She kept her head down, clutching the carved wooden spool in her apron pocket, as if it could generate heat. She was a possession now, a piece of human ledger ink, traded for $3,000 of dead men's debt. Silas Abbott's final words echoed in her mind, "Take her out of my sight." She expected Garrett to lead her to a broken-down cart or force her to walk the long miles up the ridge. But at the edge of the Abbott property line, tied to a bare elm tree, stood a massive black draft horse hitched to a battered, heavy-duty timber wagon. It was not a carriage for a gentleman, but it was sturdy, built to survive the brutal mountain passes. Garrett unhitched the horse. He didn't speak. He didn't issue commands. He merely stood by the wagon wheel, waiting. Ruth approached the wagon, her entire body shaking. The wooden side of the cart was high, designed to hold rough-cut pine, not passengers. She reached up with her raw, bleeding hands, gripping the splintered wood. The moment her split knuckles took her weight, a sharp, white-hot pain shot up her arms. She gasped, her grip failing, and her knees buckled. She braced herself for the impact of the frozen ground. She braced herself for the shout, the curse, the sharp reprimand for being clumsy and useless. It never came. A hand caught her by the upper arm. The grip was impossibly strong, halting her fall instantly. But it wasn't cruel. Garrett held her steady, his amber-brown eyes dropping to her hands. The red lines on her knuckles had split open again, bright blood stark against her pale, freezing skin. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he placed his large hands firmly around her waist and lifted her off the ground as easily as if she were a sack of flour, setting her gently onto the wooden bench of the wagon. Ruth shrank back immediately, pulling her knees together, her eyes wide with the instinct of a hunted animal. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling violently from the cold and the fear. I can climb. I can do it myself. Garrett stood by the wheel, looking at her. Her lips were turning a faint, dangerous shade of blue. The gray apron was stiff with frost. Slowly, Garrett unbuttoned his dust-covered canvas coat. Ruth's breath hitched. In Abbott Manor, when a man removed his coat in front of a servant, it meant punishment or worse. She pressed herself back against the wooden bench, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of her dress. Garrett pulled the heavy coat off his shoulders. Underneath, he wore only a faded flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, entirely insufficient for the biting wind. He stepped up onto the wheel hub, leaned into the wagon, and dropped the heavy canvas coat squarely over Ruth's shaking shoulders. The weight of it almost knocked the breath out of her. It was massive, swallowing her small frame entirely. And it was warm. It smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold mountain air. "Put your arms in," Garrett said. It wasn't a suggestion. Ruth stared at him, paralyzed. "Sir, you'll freeze. The wind is—" "I don't freeze," Garrett interrupted, his voice flat. "Put your arms in, or the cold will take your fingers before we reach the tree line." With trembling, bleeding hands, Ruth slid her arms into the oversized leaves. The canvas was thick, lined with a rough wool that immediately began trapping her sparse body heat. It was the warmest thing she had worn in a decade. She pulled the collar up around her neck, instinctively burying her face in the thick fabric. Garrett reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a battered metal canteen. He uncapped it and held it out to her. "Drink," he ordered. Ruth took it with both hands, her raw knuckles protesting. The water was shockingly cold, but it cleared the dust and fear from her throat. When she tried to hand it back, he shook his head. "Keep it. We have 2 hours of climbing." Garrett climbed onto the bench beside her, taking the heavy leather reins in his bare hands. He didn't look at her again. He snapped the reins, and the massive draft horse leaned into the harness, pulling the heavy timber wagon forward onto the frozen trail. They left Abbott Manor behind. Ruth sat huddled in the corner of the bench, the oversized canvas coat acting as a fortress against the wind. She watched the grand stone pillars of her former prison fade into the gray afternoon mist. She turned her gaze to the man beside her. Garrett Thorne drove the wagon in absolute silence. The wind tore at his flannel shirt, whipping his dark hair across his forehead, but he didn't shiver. He sat impeccably straight, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the treacherous mountain road ahead. He was supposed to be a ruined man, a desperate beggar who had sold his pride to clear a debt. But as Ruth watched him navigate a dangerous, ice-slicked curve with effortless, quiet strength, a strange thought crept into her mind. Ruined men slouched. Defeated men complained about the cold. Garrett Thorne did neither. He handled the reins like a man who owned the very mountain they were climbing. And beneath the heavy canvas coat she was wearing, tucked into the inner pocket, Ruth felt the hard shape of something metallic. She carefully slipped her bruised fingers inside, tracing the cool edge of silver. It was a spare pocket watch, heavy and immaculate, completely at odds with the muddy boots and faded denim of the man sitting next to her. The wind howled through the high pines, bringing the first sharp flakes of a coming blizzard. Ruth gripped the carved wooden spool in her apron and the heavy silver watch in the coat, realizing with a sudden, quiet terror that the man who had bought her was hiding something far more dangerous than poverty. The blizzard hit them halfway up the ridge, a blinding wall of white that swallowed the trail and dropped the temperature to a lethal, biting extreme. Ruth huddled beneath Garrett's heavy canvas coat, her face buried in the wool-lined collar, shaking until her bones ached. Beside her, Garrett did not flinch. He navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked switchbacks by memory, his bare hands steady on the leather reins while the snow gathered in his dark hair. When the wagon finally ground to a halt, the light had already failed, leaving the mountain in deep, howling shadows. Through the swirling snow, Ruth made out the silhouette of a cabin. It sat tucked against a towering wall of granite, shielded from the worst of the northern wind. It wasn't a sprawling estate, and it possessed none of the polished elegance of Abbott Manor. It was made of massive, rough-hewn pine logs, built low and wide, designed purely to survive the brutal high country. Garrett secured the reins and jumped down. He led the massive draft horse to a sturdy lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, tossing a thick blanket over the animal's back. When he returned to the wagon, Ruth was struggling to stand. Her legs were numb, her thin leather shoes entirely frozen to the floorboards. Before she could force her raw hands to grip the icy side of the wagon, Garrett was there. He reached up, his large hands spanning her waist, and lifted her effortlessly through the falling snow. He didn't set her down in the freezing mud. He carried her the last 10 yards, kicking the heavy timber door open with his boot and stepping inside. He set her down gently on the plank floor, kicking the door shut behind them. The immediate absence of the screaming wind left a ringing silence in Ruth's ears. The cabin was pitch black and bitterly cold, smelling of old wood ash, dried pine, and leather. Instinct kicked in before logic. In Abbott Ma, nor, standing idle, meant a beating. Ruth's frozen hands fumbled in the dark, her panicked breath coming in short gasps. "Sir, the floor. Where's the broom? I can sweep the snow before it melts. I can—" Stop. The word was low, barely more than a rumble in the dark, but it froze her in place. A match flared. The sudden burst of yellow light illuminated Garrett's face. The snow on his shoulders was already beginning to melt, dampening his flannel shirt. He held the match to a kerosene lantern on a heavy oak table, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. Ruth stood rigid near the door, trapped inside the oversized canvas coat, waiting for the inevitable order. She was property. She had been bought for $3,000. She was fully prepared to be told where to scrub, where to sleep, and what her grueling new life would entail. Garrett didn't look at her. He moved to the stone hearth, grabbing a handful of kindling and striking another match. Within seconds, a fire caught, the flames licking hungrily at the dry birch logs he stacked with quiet precision. The firelight danced across the rough timber walls, casting long, dancing shadows. He stood up, dusted his hands on his denim trousers, and finally turned to her. "Take the coat off," he said. Ruth swallowed hard. Her bruised fingers struggled with the heavy buttons, her joints stiff and agonizingly slow. It watched her struggle for a moment, then crossed the room. He didn't swat her hands away. He simply reached out and, with deft, careful movements, unbuttoned the coat himself. He lifted it from her shoulders and draped it over a wooden chair near the hearth. "Sit," he told her, pointing to the chair. Ruth obeyed, her legs trembling as she sank into the seat. The heat from the fire hit her face, a shocking, glorious wave of warmth that made her eyes water. Garrett moved to a cast-iron pump at a small copper sink, an expensive luxury in a mountain cabin, though Ruth was too cold to notice the irregularity. He filled the tin basin with water, set it on the iron stove over the fire to warm, and then walked to a dark wooden cupboard. Ruth kept her hands tucked tightly in her apron, her thumb rubbing the carved wooden spool in her pocket. She watched him with wide, cautious eyes. He moved with a practiced, predatory grace, entirely silent on the wooden floorboards. He was a terrifying man to look at, rugged and scarred, yet he hadn't raised his voice once. When the water in the basin began to steam, Garrett took it off the stove with a thick cloth and brought it to her. He set it on a small wooden stool beside her chair. He dropped a clean, white linen towel into her lap. "Soak your hands," he said quietly. Ruth stared at the steaming water. In 21 years, no one had ever drawn warm water for her. I can start supper, sir, if you point me to the pantry." "I said, soak your hands." His amber-brown eyes met hers, leaving no room for argument. "You're bleeding on the floor." Ruth looked down. It was true. The cracked skin on her knuckles had opened further in the freezing ride, slow drops of crimson staining the hem of her apron. Slowly, fearfully, she pulled her hands from her pockets and submerged them in the warm water. The heat stung viciously at first, then gave way to a deep, agonizing relief. A ragged sigh slipped past her lips, her eyes fluttering shut for just a second. When she opened them, Garrett was already at the stove, pouring something from a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven into a tin bowl. He brought it over, setting it on the table near her chair. It was a thick, rich venison stew, smelling of roasted root vegetables and wild thyme. Alongside it, he placed a thick slice of dark bread. He didn't hand her a spoon immediately, but holding the thread made her dangerous. And Montgomery didn't leave dangerous things alive. Suddenly, the cabin grew painfully bright. Ethan stood up and walked to the window. Clara followed his gaze. The howling wind that had battered the timber walls all night had completely died down. The sky outside was a piercing, cloudless blue. The sun glared blindingly off the massive snowdrifts that choked the Pine Ridge. The storm had broken. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, stepping up beside him, instinctively resting her hand on her stomach. "It's clear," Ethan corrected, his voice devoid of any romantic illusion. He stared down the mountain toward the invisible town buried in the valley below. "The snow is 3 feet deep. It will take Montgomery and the sheriff 2 days to dig out the lower trail with heavy horses." He turned to look at her, his expression utterly serious, his aura settling into the cold, calculated readiness of a protector preparing for a siege. "We have 48 hours before they come up this mountain to finish what they started." The 48 hours Ethan had predicted turned out to be a generous estimation. Men who made their living stealing land and terrorizing widows did not respect the natural pause of a mountain winter. By nightfall, the wind had picked up again, a low, moaning whistle that rattled the heavy timber beams of the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rendered venison fat and simmering root vegetables. Clara had spent the afternoon working, moving with a steady, determined rhythm. If this cabin was going to be a fortress, it was going to be a well-provisioned one. Ethan sat near the hearth, sharpening a long, heavy hunting knife with a wet stone. The rhythmic shh-shh of the steel against the stone was the only sound in the room competing with the crackle of the fire. He had already shuttered the 2 small windows with thick oak planks, bolting them from the inside. He had moved the heavy wooden table closer to the bed, creating a secondary barricade that Clara could crouch behind if the front door gave way. He watched her as she stirred the heavy iron pot. She was exhausted, the shadows under her hazel eyes stark against her pale skin, but she refused to sit down. Her hands, dusted with flour, occasionally dropped to rest protectively over her stomach, a subconscious gesture that tied a tight, invisible knot in Ethan's chest. Suddenly, Clara gasped. She dropped the wooden spoon, her hands flying to her abdomen, her breath hitching sharply. Ethan was on his feet instantly. The hunting knife clattered onto the floorboards. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his hands hovering inches from her shoulders, wanting to steady her but refusing to cross the boundary of her physical space without permission. "Clara," he said, his voice stripped of its usual guarded distance, raw with immediate concern. "Are you hurt?" Clara stood completely still for a moment, her eyes wide. Then, a slow, disbelieving breath shuddered out of her lungs. The tension in her shoulders broke, and a faint, watery smile touched her lips. "No," she whispered, looking up at his fierce, steel-gray eyes. "No, I'm not hurt. The baby, he just kicked, for the first time." Ethan froze. The sheer, overwhelming fragility of it, a new life moving in the dark, surrounded by the brutal, freezing edge of a frontier winter, hit him harder than a physical blow. He looked down at her hands, wrapped tightly around her belly beneath the faded blue apron. For 5 years, Ethan had believed that he was only good for surviving. He had believed that bringing anyone into his world meant bringing them into the cold. But looking at Clara now, seeing the fierce, maternal defiance in her eyes, he realized that survival wasn't just about outlasting the storm. It was about keeping the fire lit for someone else. "Sit down," Ethan said softly, his voice dropping to a gentle, grounding rumble. He pulled a wooden stool closer to the stove. "The soup can wait. Let him rest." Clara nodded, her knees suddenly weak with the adrenaline of the moment. She sank onto the stool, taking a slow, deep breath of the pine-scented air. Ethan turned back to retrieve his knife, but before he could reach it, the deep, ancient instincts that had kept him alive in the high country flared to life. It wasn't a sound. It was the sudden, unnatural absence of one. The wind outside was still howling, but the faint, rhythmic scratching of the pine branches against the eastern wall had stopped. Something was blocking the wind. Someone was standing right outside the cabin. Ethan's demeanor changed in a fraction of a heartbeat. The gentle protector vanished, replaced entirely by the lethal, silent predator of the Pine Ridge. He held up a single finger to his lips, his eyes locking onto Clara's. Silence. Clara's blood ran cold, but she didn't panic. She didn't scream. She nodded once, her hand slipping down from her stomach to close around the heavy, notched handle of the iron ladle resting on the counter. It wasn't a rifle, but it was solid iron, and she was done being a victim. Ethan moved with absolute economy. He stepped over the floorboards he knew would creak, reaching the oil lantern hanging from the center beam. With a quick twist, he extinguished the flame. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the low, angry red glow of the hearth fire. He picked up his Winchester rifle from the table, levering around into the chamber with a sharp, terrifying clack. He pointed to the barricade behind the heavy wooden bed. Clara moved immediately, slipping silently behind the thick timber frame, clutching her iron ladle to her chest, her breathing shallow and controlled. A heavy, muffled thud echoed from the front door. Someone was testing the iron latch. Montgomery hadn't waited. He had sent his hired muscle up the ridge on snowshoes under the cover of the storm, intending to finish the job quietly, violently, and without witnesses. "Open it up, Sterling," a muffled, gravelly voice called from the other side of the thick wood. "We know the woman is in there. Hand her out, and Montgomery might let you keep your claim on this ridge. Make us come in, and we burn you both out." Ethan stood 3 feet from the door, his face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. He didn't bother responding. He knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. They didn't negotiate, they intimidated. And when intimidation failed, they used fire. A heavy, rhythmic pounding began. They were using a chopped pine log as a makeshift battering ram against the heavy timber door. The iron hinges groaned, but the crossbeam held firm. Then came the sound Ethan was waiting for, the crunch of heavy boots circling around to the back of the cabin, toward the small, shuttered window near the kitchen. They were trying to flank him. Ethan turned his head. "Stay down," he whispered into the shadows where Clara hid. The front door took another massive hit, the wood splintering inward. At the exact same moment, the rear window shutter exploded inward with a deafening crash of breaking glass and splintering oak. A man in a heavy sheepskin coat shoved his upper body through the broken window frame, a long-barreled Colt revolver gripped in his hand, sweeping blindly in the dim firelight. He didn't see Ethan. He didn't see the barrel of the Winchester swing around. But before Ethan could pull the trigger, the intruder's free hand blindly grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter for leverage. From the shadows, Clara moved. She didn't wait to be rescued. With a fierce, terrifying surge of protective instinct for the child in her womb, she swung the heavy iron ladle with both hands, bringing the notched iron down with bone-crushing force, directly onto the wrist of the hand holding the revolver. The man screamed, a high, ragged sound of absolute agony. The Colt clattered to the floorboards. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbing the screaming man by the collar of his sheepskin coat, and threw him violently backward out the broken window. The man hit the snow outside with a heavy crunch and didn't get up. Before the men at the front door could react to the scream, Ethan unbolted the heavy crossbeam and kicked the front door open himself. The wind roared into the cabin, sending a flurry of snow and sparks across the floor. Two thugs stood on the porch, holding the makeshift battering ram. They froze in shock as the door flew open, expecting to break in, not to be invited. Ethan leveled the Winchester at the chest of the larger man. The blast in the confined space of the porch was deafening. The man was thrown backward off the steps, tumbling into the deep snowdrift. The second man dropped the log, his hands flying up in panicked surrender. "Wait! Wait! We were just paid to rattle the door!" Ethan stepped out onto the freezing porch, the barrel of the smoking rifle aimed directly at the man's face. The storm whipped at his canvas coat, but he stood completely immovable, a force of nature infinitely more dangerous than the blizzard. "Who set you?" Ethan demanded, his voice cutting through the wind like a rusted blade. "Montgomery! It was Montgomery!" the thug stammered, falling backward onto the snowy boards. "He said the clerk's ledger was up here. He said to burn the cabin and make it look like a winter fire. Just let me go, man." "Tell Montgomery," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register that promised absolute ruin, "that if he wants this ledger, he can come to the town hall assembly on Monday and take it from my hand." Ethan struck the man across the jaw with the heavy wooden stock of the rifle. The thug slumped into the snow, unconscious. The ridge went silent again, save for the howling wind. Ethan turned slowly and walked back into the cabin, pulling the splintered door shut and forcing the crossbeam back into place. He turned to the kitchen. Clara was standing near the broken window, her chest heaving, the heavy iron ladle still gripped tightly in her trembling hands. The cold wind was blowing through the shattered glass, tangling her chestnut hair across her face, but she stood her ground. She hadn't cowered. She had fought. Ethan stared at her, the adrenaline of the fight slowly ebbing away, replaced by a profound, awestruck respect. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior in a faded blue apron. He walked over to her, taking off his heavy canvas coat and wrapping it gently over her shivering shoulders. He looked down at the iron ladle in her hand, then up into her fierce, tear-filled eyes. "I told you I'd carry the iron," Ethan murmured, his voice softening, a rare, genuine warmth breaking through the harsh lines of his face. Clara let out a shaking breath, leaning her forehead against his chest for just a second, letting his solid, steady heartbeat ground her. "I'm a cook, Ethan," she whispered, her grip finally loosening on the handle. "I know how to use my tools." Ethan reached up, his rough thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "We can't just wait for them to send more men," Clara said, looking up at him, the reality of their situation setting in. "If Montgomery wants that ledger badly enough to burn us alive, it proves what you said. It's the key to everything." "Then we stop waiting," Ethan said. He looked toward the heavy wooden table where the forged ledger was hidden. "We rest tonight. Tomorrow we dig out the trail. On Monday, we take the ledger to Silver Creek, and we burn Montgomery's empire to the ground." Sunday was a day of brutal, freezing labor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of blinding, fractured blue and snowdrifts that swallowed the lower trunks of the pines. Ethan had spent from dawn until dusk breaking a trail down the ridge, his massive shoulders driving a heavy wooden snowplow behind his sure-footed draft horse. Clara had stayed in the cabin, keeping the hearth blazing and baking heavy, unleavened travel bread. She washed her faded cotton dress, scrubbing the mud and ash from the hem, and mended a tear in her blue apron. She was going back to Silver Creek, and she refused to arrive looking like a victim who had barely survived. She would return looking like a woman who owned her own kitchen. By Monday morning, the cold was sharp enough to crack stone. Ethan brought the draft horse to the porch. He helped Clara up into the saddle, wrapping her securely in his heavy canvas coat over her own ruined winter layers. She looked small, swallowed in his gear, but when she gripped the reins, her knuckles were white with determination. Slung across her back in the canvas satchel were the wrapped ledger and her heavy iron ladle. Ethan walked ahead of the horse, his Winchester resting casually over his shoulder, his boots breaking the crust of the snow. He didn't speak much during the descent. The silence between them had evolved. It was no longer the hollow quiet of two strangers, but the heavy, unified stillness of a vanguard moving toward a battlefield. They reached Silver Creek just before noon. The town was a mess of shoveled walkways and muddy slush. Wagons were parked haphazardly along Main Street outside the town hall. Smoke poured from the 10 chimney of the large municipal building. Inside, the weekly assembly and public auction were underway. Ethan halted the horse near the hitching post. He looked up at Clara, his steel-gray eyes searching her pale, resolute face. The wind whipped a stray chestnut curl across her cheek. "You don't have to walk in there first," Ethan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I can clear the room." "No," Clara said, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the freezing air. Her hand rested for a fleeting second on the swell of her stomach beneath the heavy canvas coat. "He shamed me in front of this town. He threw me out to freeze while they watched. If you walk in first, they'll say I'm just hiding behind a man's gun. I have to be the one who drops the paper on his desk." Ethan's jaw tightened, a profound respect flashing in his eyes. He reached up, resting his rough, calloused hand over hers on the saddle horn. "Then I stand right behind you," he promised. "No one touches you. Not today, not ever." Clara nodded, drawing strength from the absolute certainty in his touch. She climbed down from the horse, adjusting her faded blue apron and gripping the canvas satchel tight. Inside the town hall, the air was thick with body heat, damp wool, and cheap tobacco. Nearly 50 people were crowded onto the wooden benches. At the front of the room, standing behind a heavy oak podium, was Vance Montgomery. Sheriff Tate stood by the wall, arms crossed, looking bored and completely complicit. Moving on to the seized assets, Montgomery's oily voice echoed off the rafters, projecting a false civic authority. Lot number 4, the property formerly known as Finch's Diner. Due to severe structural hazards and delinquent municipal fees, the county has condemned the building. I will start the bidding at $40 for the land value alone. A heavy, comfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Old Man Miller looked down at his boots. The town blacksmith crossed his arms, his face dark with silent anger. Everyone knew the diner was worth 10 times that, and everyone knew Montgomery would be the only one to bid. "Do I hear 40? Montgomery asked, a smug, victorious smile pulling at his lips. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall slammed open with a sound like a rifle crack. The freezing wind rushed in, extinguishing the 2 lanterns nearest the entrance. The entire assembly turned as one. Clara Finch stepped over the threshold. She looked nothing like the broken, freezing woman they had watched being shoved into the snow on Saturday night. She walked with her spine perfectly straight, wrapped in a massive canvas trapper's coat, her faded blue apron visible beneath it. And a half step behind her, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the doorway, was Ethan Sterling. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hiss of the wood stove in the corner. Montgomery's smug smile vanished. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, mottled gray. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles popped. He had sent 3 armed men up the ridge. He had expected to announce a tragic winter casualty by Wednesday. "Bidding is closed, Montgomery," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and steady across the silent hall. She walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for her, men instinctively stepping back to give a wide berth to the towering, heavily armed mountain man shadowing her every step. Ethan didn't draw his rifle, but his hands rested near his belt, his eyes sweeping the room, tracking every sudden movement, every shifted boot. He was a coiled spring, and the town felt it. "Sheriff Tate," Montgomery barked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Arrest this woman. She is trespassing on municipal proceedings. Arrest that man for assault on my employees." Sheriff Tate pushed himself off the wall, his hand resting hesitantly on his gun butt. He took one step forward. Ethan stopped walking. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply turned his head and locked his steel-gray eyes on the sheriff. "Take another step, Tate," Ethan said quietly, the low gravel of his voice carrying perfectly in the silent room. "And you'd better be ready to use that badge as a shield." Tate swallowed hard. He looked at Ethan's size, at the lethal, practiced stillness of a man who hunted predators for a living. And then he looked at the crowd. The townspeople weren't backing the sheriff. The blacksmith had actually stepped forward, his fists clenched. Tate slowly, carefully, moved his hand away from his holster and took a step back. Clara reached the front of the room. She didn't look at the sheriff. She kept her blazing hazel eyes fixed entirely on Vance Montgomery. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the crumpled debt ledger. With a sharp, deliberate motion, she slapped the heavy parchment onto the oak podium, right over Montgomery's auction gavel. $50 in back-assessed county improvement fees, Clara said, her voice shaking with righteous fury, yet refusing to break. "That's what you claimed I owed. That's why you threw me into a blizzard to die." "It is a legal county document," Montgomery sputtered, desperately trying to regain the high ground. "You failed to pay." "My father paid it in full before he died," Clara shot back. She turned to face the crowded room. "And this ledger wasn't signed by a legitimate county clerk. It was signed by Silas Thorne." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, quickly turning into a rising tide of realization. Ethan stepped up beside her. "Silas Thorne was run out of the federal surveyor's office 5 years ago for forging property lines," Ethan announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "He isn't a clerk. He's a convicted forger. Montgomery has been using him to draft fake tax liens to steal your land." The blacksmith pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "Let me see that paper," he bellowed. Clara slid it across the podium. The blacksmith squinted at the signature, his face turning an angry, volatile shade of red. "I lost my forge in October to a tax assessment. The signature on the bottom was Silas Thorne. Montgomery bought my shop for $20. "Mine too," the old miller called out from the back, his voice shaking with rage. The gristmill lien was signed by Thorne. The room erupted. 50 people, who had spent the last 2 years living in quiet, suffocated terror of Vance Montgomery's wealth and ledger books, suddenly realized they outnumbered him. The anger was palpable, a physical wave of outrage crashing toward the podium. Montgomery stumbled backward, knocking his chair over. "This is a lie. It's a conspiracy. Sheriff, protect me." Sheriff Tate looked at the furious crowd, then at the forged paper on the podium. He made a quick, cowardly calculation of his own survival. "Looks to me like a federal matter, Montgomery," Tate muttered, backing toward the side exit. "I ain't getting involved in forgery." "You're ruined, Vance," Clara said, stepping forward. She wasn't just a widowed cook anymore. She was the woman who had survived the mountain, and the fire in her eyes promised that she would never be treated as property again. The circuit judge comes through next week. We have the paper, and we have the whole town to testify. Your empire is over. Montgomery looked around wildly, searching for an exit, for a hired gun, for anything to save him. But his thugs were either unconscious on the mountain or long gone, and the town he had terrorized had formed a solid wall of angry bodies blocking the door. The blacksmith grabbed Montgomery by the velvet collar of his expensive coat, lifting him nearly off his feet. "We're going to hold you right here in the jailhouse until that judge arrives," the blacksmith growled. "And then we're taking our land back." As the crowd surged forward, dragging a screaming, panicked Montgomery toward the holding cells, the chaos of the room swallowed the podium. Ethan placed a heavy hand gently on Clara's shoulder, pulling her slightly back from the crush of the crowd. He positioned his body between her and the churning mob, a silent, unmovable barrier ensuring that not a single elbow or shoving shoulder came near her stomach. Clara leaned back into his solid chest, letting out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days. Her legs suddenly felt like water. She gripped the heavy iron ladle through the canvas of her satchel, anchoring herself. She looked up at Ethan. The hard, dangerous lines of his face had softened. He looked down at her, the chaotic noise of the town hall fading into the background. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, his voice a profound, steady comfort. "We did it," Clara corrected, her hand reaching up to grasp the rough fabric of his canvas sleeve. They stood together in the center of the room. The town was reclaiming its future, but Clara had already reclaimed hers. She looked toward the window, where the sun was glaring brightly off the snow-covered street, and for the first time in nearly a year, she wasn't afraid of the cold. The spring thaw came to Silver Creek not with a whisper, but with a sudden, violent rush of melting ice and roaring creeks. The snow that had threatened to bury Clara Finch alive slowly retreated, revealing the dark, fertile earth beneath. By late April, the hand-painted sign above the diner on Main Street had been rehung with heavy iron chains. It no longer rattled in the wind. It was securely anchored, just like the woman who ran the kitchen inside. Vance Montgomery was gone. The circuit judge had arrived in early December, taking one look at the forged ledger and the 50 angry townspeople standing behind Clara, and ordered Montgomery held without bail. He was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary in the Eastern Territory, his freight company dismantled and the stolen properties returned to their rightful owners. Elias Thorne, the disgraced clerk, had fled before the snow even melted, leaving his false ledgers to burn in the town hall stove. Inside Finch's place, the afternoon rush was finally dying down. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pork, wild thyme, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of fresh-baked bread. Clara stood near the cast-iron stove, wiping her hands on her faded blue apron. She was 7 months along now, her pregnancy clearly visible, but she moved with a renewed, unshakable vitality. The shadows of exhaustion and fear that used to haunt her hazel eyes were entirely gone. She was no longer a widow desperate for survival. She was the heart of the town, the woman who had stood up to a tyrant and won. The front door swung open. It didn't slam. It opened steadily, held by a large, calloused hand. Ethan Sterling ducked his head slightly to clear the frame. He carried a massive canvas sack of flour over one broad shoulder, as easily as if it were a feather pillow. He wore his heavy canvas coat open, the trail dust long since brushed away, revealing a clean, dark wool shirt beneath. The few remaining patrons in the diner, Old Man Miller and a couple of freighters, nodded respectfully to him. In Silver Creek, Ethan was no longer viewed as just a transient mountain man. He was the man who had stared down a corrupt sheriff and broken Montgomery's muscle. He was a quiet, living legend who walked the town streets with a slow, lethal grace, but whose eyes only ever softened when he looked at the kitchen door. "Put that in the back pantry, Ethan," Clara called out, a warm, genuine smile breaking across her face as he stepped into the kitchen. Ethan didn't say a word. He just offered a faint, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, carrying the heavy sack into the back room. A lot had changed in 5 months. After the town assembly, Ethan hadn't gone back up the ridge. He had stayed in the back room of the diner, fixing the sticking oven damper, repairing the drafty windows, and quietly positioning his bedroll exactly between Clara's door and the front entrance. He slept with his back to the door, his Winchester leaning against the wall, a silent vow that the terror of that November night would never touch her again. When the last customer finally left, Clara turned the closed sign in the window and drew the heavy cotton curtains. The diner settled into a warm, comfortable twilight. She walked into the back room, resting her hand on the swell of her stomach. Her back ached from the long hours on her feet, a dull throb that she usually tried to ignore. But before she could even reach for a chair, Ethan was there. He didn't ask if she was tired. He simply pulled the heavy cushioned rocking chair out from the corner, a chair he had carved and assembled himself during the long winter evenings, and gestured to it. "Sit," he said, his low, gravelly voice leaving no room for argument. Clara sighed, a happy, exhausted sound, and sank into the chair. Ethan knelt in front of her, his massive, scarred hands that could skin a buck or break a man's jaw without hesitation, gently unlaced her flour-dusted boots and slipped them off her swollen feet. "I can do that myself, you know," she murmured, though she made no move to stop him. "I know you can," Ethan replied smoothly. "Doesn't mean you have to." He stood up, walking over to the stove to pour a cup of hot, steeped mint tea, brought it to her, his fingers brushing against hers as she took the tin cup. The calluses on his skin were familiar now, an anchor that grounded her every single day. "The snow is completely gone from the upper ridge," Clara noted softly, blowing steam from her cup. She watched his face carefully. "The trapping trails are clear. The federal bounty office is opening back up in the valley." Ethan leaned against the heavy timber doorframe of the pantry, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at her, his steel gray eyes unblinking and entirely focused. "They are," he agreed quietly. Clara swallowed, her heart giving a nervous little flutter. They hadn't spoken about the future. They had lived in the present, surviving the winter, rebuilding the diner, and existing in a quiet, deeply domestic rhythm. But spring meant the frontier was open again. It meant a solitary man could return to his isolation. "Are you planning to pack your gear?" she asked, her voice dropping a fraction. She hated the slight tremble in her words, the lingering fear of abandonment that still shadowed her heart. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed off the doorframe and walked over to the wooden counter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 heavy, hand-forged iron nails. He picked up a hammer and drove them into the sturdy wooden beam directly above the stove, right in the heart of the kitchen. Clara watched, confused, as he set the hammer down. Ethan picked up Clara's mother's wooden rolling pin. He hung it securely on the first iron nail. Then he reached over and picked up the heavy, notched iron ladle, the tool she had used to defend her life in his cabin, the object that had traveled through the storm with them. He hung it on the second nail, right beside the wood. He turned back to her, the firelight catching the silver at his temples, and the profound, immovable certainty in his eyes. "I spent 5 years freezing on that ridge," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a low, raw rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I thought keeping the world out was the only way to stay alive. But a man doesn't build a fire just to sit by it alone. Not when he's finally found the one thing worth keeping warm." He walked over to the rocking chair and knelt beside her again, his large hands coming to rest gently on the armrests, boxing her in with absolute, protective warmth. "I'm not going back up the mountain, Clara," he said, holding her tear-filled hazel eyes with fierce devotion. "I'm not going anywhere. My home is right here, with you, and with him." He slowly, reverently moved one rough hand to rest over the swell of her stomach. The baby kicked against his palm, a strong, rhythmic thump. Ethan's breath hitched slightly, his eyes softening into something breathtakingly tender. Clara let out a choked sob, tears of pure, overwhelming joy spilling over her eyelashes. She reached out, her hands framing his weathered, rugged face, feeling the faint, faded scar near his jaw. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of pine resin and clean wool that always clung to him. "You saved my life, Ethan," she whispered against his skin. "You opened that door when the whole world wanted me to freeze." "You saved mine the second you walked through it," he murmured, turning his head just enough to press a deep, lingering kiss into the palm of her hand. Outside, the frontier town of Silver Creek was quiet, the muddy streets settling under the spring moon. But inside the kitchen, the fire burned bright and steady. The woman who had been cast out, hunted, and treated as property had finally found her sanctuary. And the lonely mountain man, who had spent his life fighting the brutal cold, had finally found the one safe place he would defend until his last breath. They didn't need a massive cabin on a ridge to be safe. They had each other. And as Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his broad, unyielding chest, Clara knew, with absolute certainty, that they would never be cold again.